My name is Imad Harb, and I am the Director of Research at Arab Center, Washington, D.C. While this was not the first time, the Houthis' attack on the United Arab Emirates last week represented a serious escalation in the conflict in Yemen and to all those involved in addressing it. News from the UAE last night spoke of another aborted attack, an aborted attack by drones that were downed before they hit their targets. For the Houthis to feel emboldened enough to launch such drone and ballistic missile attacks 1,000 miles away means that the Yemen conflict is very far from a resolution that can arrest the state of chaos in the country, indeed in the whole Arabian Peninsula, or address the calamitous humanitarian conditions in Yemen. Of course, the retaliatory attacks on Sana'a that have killed dozens of Yemenis also increase the possibility of both keeping the conflict alive and expanding its scope and severity. According to the United Nations figures, almost 400,000 Yemenis have died as of the end of 2021. The United Nations Human Development Program says that 60% of those who died of indirect causes such as famine and disease. 70% of the dead have been children. More than 16 million Yemenis are food insecure. 5 million are on the brink of famine. Increased food prices are adding to the risk of famine and malnutrition. The UN Higher Commission for Refugees estimates that 4.6 million have fled their domiciles. Conditions like this are certainly not helped by Houthi attacks on neighboring countries or continued mutual attacks between the antagonists. This conflict has made the life of Yemenis unbearable and threatens the region's stability. With us today is Dr. Kristian Ulrichsen, who is a non-resident fellow, a senior fellow at Arab Center, Washington, D.C., and a Baker Institute fellow for the Middle East at Rice University. His research focuses on rule of law and due process in Middle Eastern and Arab Gulf states, issues of internal security and stability, and contemporary and early 20th century Middle Eastern history. Among his publications are Qatar and the Arab Spring, the United Arab Emirates, Power, Politics, and Policy Making, and Qatar and the Gulf Crisis. Welcome, Dr. Ulrichsen.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for joining us. First of all, I mean, the question that really poses itself is, what does this Houthi attack really signify as far as, at the present time, as far as the Yemen conflict is concerned, and as far as the whole Arabian Peninsula is concerned?
Well, the UAE claimed in July 2019 to have withdrawn the majority of its forces from Yemen from the conflict. And people at the time pointed out it wasn't as much a withdrawal as a recalibration of the way in which the UAE was seeking to maintain political, military, and security influence, in part by continuing its support for UAE-backed forces in southern and western Yemen. And what we've seen over the past month, since December 2021, has been moves by one of those UAE-backed forces that had been active in western Yemen, in Taiz and Hodeida, the Amalika Brigade, Giant Brigade. We've seen them move into Shabwa and move into a much more proximate area to where the conflict against the Houthis has been. And so we have seen the UAE, in some regards, re-entering the fray and really becoming central once again to the coalition fight against the Houthis in ways that it hadn't been for a number of years. And so I think the latest, well, the two rounds of attacks, the first one last week, the second one last night as we speak, are, I think, messages from the Houthis that if you, the UAE, choose to escalate once more, this time there will be a direct response, and we will target your cities and infrastructure in the same way that they've done the same to Saudi cities and Saudi infrastructure until this point. They really had focused on Saudi Arabia, not on the UAE itself.
But do the Houthis really believe that they can force a change in the UAE position on this specific thing? Since the comparison between what the Amalika Brigade is doing in Shabwa and other places, and what some drones thrown at Abu Dhabi, I mean, is the cost or is the effect really commensurate, so to speak?
Well, I think the calculation that the Houthis are probably making is that the UAE, especially Abu Dhabi and Dubai, have really portrayed themselves as these safe places to live, work, and do business in a otherwise unstable part of the world. And that if that safe haven image is punctured, if there's seen to be a direct cost to the UAE's involvement in Yemen, and a cost that creates uncertainty in a climate of fear, then that will potentially sort of make UAE leaders think again. And so I think that's the message that is trying to be sent. Whether or not it's heard or is successful is another matter.
Yeah, well, the UAE and the Saudi-led coalition have actually responded to the attacks on Abu Dhabi, and you know, they bombed Sana'a, they bombed the detention center. I think the casualties were up to 100 or something like that. Do you think that this retaliation really makes a difference?
Well, I think we're at the risk of entering another escalatory cycle where every time there's an attack like this on the UAE or in Saudi Arabia, the response is to bomb Sana'a and bomb targets that increase the likelihood of another attack on the UAE or in Saudi Arabia. And so I think there's that real risk that the war, which is now almost about to enter its 8th year, will continue now to actually get worse. And there had been, of course, hopes that there might be some movements towards political resolution with a new UN envoy. And this cycle threatens the exact opposite. And so I think the UAE risks getting drawn even deeper into the conflict if they are seen to be taking part in these retaliatory attacks, which of course they have to be seen to be doing for domestic political purposes within the UAE itself.
Well, you know, it's hard to not to think that the UAE wants to respond, at least for just what you just said, for domestic political concerns. But you know, I don't know really how much they can really do by bombing yet more targets in Sana'a. Sana'a is practically destroyed, but the Houthis have not really changed any of their positions. But you know, the immediate concern right now is, what does this do to the domestic Yemeni issue? In other words, you know, what happens in the south of Yemen today? What happens in Shabwa? What happens in Ma'rib? These are still battles that are being fought, and you know, where do the Houthis go from here?
Well, yes, the Houthis had been making gains for much of 2020 and 2021, and some of those gains have been reversed. But the Houthis still control a large area of northern Yemen, the sort of heartland, and including the capital and a lot of resources. I think the challenge for the coalition has always been that Saudi and UAE had really almost demarcated different spheres of influence and operations. And if there's any sign that they're coming together to really try and force the Houthis back, that might be a change. But then this risks these types of escalatory actions that we've just seen. I think for the UAE, the issue is complicated also by the fact that the UAE on January the 1st took up one of the 10 non-permanent seats on the UN Security Council, which of course gives the UAE a platform now to take the issue to the Security Council. But it also risks the UAE now being complicit in these attacks, which other members of the Security Council now have condemned. We saw a meeting on Friday last week, which actually was very critical of the airstrike on Sana'a that morning. And so we see this dynamic taking place where the UAE is perhaps beginning to lose control to some extent of the narrative and also of the pace of events. And of course, also in Yemen itself, we have continuing UAE support for southern groups, which again continue to be ranged as much against the Houthis as against parts of the Saudi-led Yemen, or Saudi kind of based Yemeni government in exile.
Right. Yeah. The this is my question is going to concentrate specifically on this issue. I mean, the Battle of Shabwa was, yes, it was a loss for the Houthis, but at the same time, in a way, it was a win for Abu Rabbu's government. It's not necessarily the Southerners. So, I mean, where do the Southerners stand on this specific issue? Where do they stand on if Abu Rabbu really comes and maintains his rule, so to speak, in southern Yemen? And where do the UAE Saudi interests or positions, how do they align here?
Well, we've seen over the past 2 or 3 years, I think since the Riyadh agreement in 2019, that there has been a difficulty in aligning some of those positions. And even the Riyadh agreement was very difficult to implement it because it was a question of who moved first and who made the first concession. Yeah. And I think we saw in 2020 the Southern Transitional Council making a bid for basically autonomy within the South. And of course, that went against the interests of the Yemeni government. And so I think, although, as we said, the battles of Shabwa have to some extent reversed that dynamic, I think we also see that UAE-backed forces in southern Yemen are still very powerful on the ground, and I think probably will continue to maintain that position and will certainly not necessarily be willing to cede power and control to any reassertion of Yemeni government authority. And so this is an added layer of complexity in this whole conflict.
Yeah, I want to go back a little bit, back about 8 years back into the to the conference, so that national conference where Yemeni parties were talking about the future Yemen and including the Houthis and all that. Well, I mean, can we really go back to any of that now? Can anybody go back to any of that now, considering the conditions today?
Well, one of the points about that 2013-14 dialogue and conference was that it was trying to be inclusive. It was trying to include the Houthis and all other groups. And one of the criticisms of the UN resolutions since 2015 is that they're quite exclusionary. They define a certain specific level of actors. And of course, Yemen has moved on since then in terms of facts on the ground. And so for there to be an inclusive settlement going forward, there will have to be representatives of all parties. And I think the dilemma for the non-Houthi elements in Yemen is that the Houthis are Yemenis. They are not implanted from a different part of the Arabian Peninsula or from Iran. They are Yemenis, and they're not going to go anywhere. I mean, you can maybe try and push them back to province of Saada or something like that, but you can't get rid of them. Apart from, I mean, if you're trying to do that, you're looking at some sort of kind of cleansing strategy, which of course make things exponentially worse. And so they're not going to go anywhere. So they have to be part of some solution somehow. And getting to that point is, I think, going to be very difficult, just given the levels of anger, of bitterness, of recrimination in multiple directions, even amongst the parties to the Riyadh agreement, for example, to say nothing of the Houthi versus anti-Houthi elements as well. Right.
Yeah, I want to get into the Saudi, UAE, Iranian element here, Saudi Arabia and the UAE have for a couple of years now, actually the UAE much longer than that, have been trying to really open up on Iran, trying to accommodate something from Iran. And at the same time, still accuse Iran of supporting the Houthis and their activities in Yemen. I mean, where does this leave them, considering Iran's opening to Iran?
It will be interesting to see, because the Saudi UAE outreach, separate outreach to Iran, really intensified in 2019 after the previous round of attacks on Saudi and Emirati infrastructure. And I think there was a feeling then that this risked getting out of control. And again, in the UAE's point, risked damaging the UAE's reputation as a place to live and work and do business. And so we saw a pragmatic decision to reach out to try and de-escalate. And we actually saw, even the last few months, significant progress in terms of meetings and continuation of bilateral dialogue. And so, first of all, it'd be interesting to see whether these Houthi attacks on Abu Dhabi change that dynamic, or whether the UAE compartmentalizes and acknowledges that the Houthis are actually separate from Iran in terms of, we'll deal with Iran on one issue, we'll deal with the Houthis on the other. Of course, it does.
Can they really do this? Because the Saudis are going the opposite direction.
Well, they are, yes, absolutely. It's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. And of course, both the Saudis and the UAE, I think, will probably escalate their rhetoric in Washington in terms of trying to push back against the Biden administration's attempts, or at least any dialogue to try and re-engage in the JCPOA, because of course the Saudi UAE point was always that for them, it wasn't really possible to just reduce Iran's behavior to one issue specific to the nuclear file, but you had to also address the perception that Iran was supporting and sponsoring all these regional groups and providing them with missiles. And so that will now just strengthen that narrative, just as it has seemed that the successive rounds of meetings over the JCPOA might actually be building up to some sort of resolution. So also the dynamic in Washington, I think, will be very interesting to see how that plays out as well.
Yeah. Going to Washington, or coming to my neck of the woods here in Washington, I mean, what can the Biden administration do regarding the situation today? Secretary Blinken condemned, and the United States condemned the attack on Abu Dhabi, but yet expressed concerns about the Saudi Arabian bombing of the Sana'a prison. So apparently the administration is trying to hedge its bets, and yet is trying to put out some sort of a position. I mean, what is the position of the United States today?
Well, I think it's always struggled to find that balance, in the sense that when Biden came into office a year ago, he seemed, at least at the beginning, to try to move towards ending US support for aggressive offensive military actions. And of course, we've seen over the last year a debate about what constitutes offensive action, and what constitutes the support and sale of offensive or defensive weaponry. And of course, now with Abu Dhabi as well as Saudi Arabia under attack, we can expect to see the Saudis and the Emiratis now making the case that they need defensive weaponry, and that the definition of defensive is going to be stretched even further. I think we also saw at the beginning of the Biden administration a lot of maybe optimism, perhaps, in the administration that they would re-enter the JCPOA with Iran and then move to a follow-on agreement, which I always thought was quite a difficult task, that would then address wider issues. But of course, those wider issues for the Saudis and the UAE are now of extreme urgency and importance. And so we're going to see a clash, I think, in terms of the Saudi, Emirati, and also Israel, for example. Their sort of focus now will increase on those wider issues, even as the Biden administration is still struggling to even get back into the JCPOA. So I think this will bring things to a head, where the administration's caution, their sort of very slow movement, is now struggling even more to keep up with events on the ground, which, as we've seen, are moving quite quickly.
Yeah, I mean, Timothy Lenderking, the U.S. Special Envoy for Yemen, is in the area today, and trying to visit several capitals and trying to see everything, probably trying to organize efforts with the United Nations, but it doesn't seem like anything is really going through anywhere, getting to even a semblance of a resolution, which is really quite quite tough, in, considering that the Biden administration is really supposedly committed to the security of the UAE and Saudi Arabia, and doesn't want the Houthis to win, but yet at the same time, it really can't do very much about it.
No, and I mean, Tim Lenderking has been constantly on the move, constantly visiting the region. And that includes, I think, going to Oman, where, of course, the Omanis have been hosting Houthi delegations. So, I mean, there have been contacts, but I think the difficulty has been arriving at any form of agreement that all parties can live with. And I think that was the difficulty in 2021, a year ago when Biden came into office. And I think it's actually worse now, because as we said, the UAE and Saudi, but especially now the UAE, will be in less of a mood, I think, to compromise now that they're seeing these direct attacks. And so we may look back in the future and look back on that sort of first few months of 2021 as a window lost, a window of opportunity, with Tim Lenderking's appointment, with Biden's initial statements on Yemen from January through to about April, as an opportunity that was missed. And it's going to be much more difficult to try and regain that window to try and make a meaningful shift in position.
Right. Now, one last question. The UAE and Saudi Arabia may find themselves that they are really painted into a corner, and they have to respond one way or the other. But we can't keep responding. I mean, this war has to end. It cannot just keep on and on and on going. And sometimes you just you can't have cannon fodder anymore. I mean, who is the cannon fodder anymore? The Yemenis have died, and Yemen itself is destroyed, and who the Sudanese are going to be pulling their troops out. I don't think the Sudanese are going to remain there. Whom will Saudi Arabia and the UAE rely upon to try to help in this situation?
Well, I think the UAE made that calculation in 2019, where they withdrew their own forces and have continued now to finance and support and arm local groups on the ground, which arguably continues to escalate and complicate the situation, because you have these local forces with regional support, and that includes the Houthis with Iran. But of course, it's the local groups which ultimately will have to find some way of living with each other if Yemen is to make peace. But as long as these local forces are receiving external support, then the chances of them coming together and realizing they have more to gain by ending the war than by continuing the conflict, that's going to continue. And so I think that's going to be the problem that we're going to see. And we don't see a resolution to that anytime soon.
And the hemorrhaging in Yemen will continue, unfortunately. Dr. Ulrichsen, thank you very, very much for joining us today. We appreciate your insights on this very, very important topic. We appreciate it. Thank you very, very much. And thank you all for listening to this interview. Thank you.